Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My brothers and sisters, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to bless you and your families. We are once again in our Wednesday night class, going down this journey of trying to learn our religion. And tonight's class is a kind of a different in that it is not an Islamic theoretical subject, but it's nevertheless a very important topic, because in order to know where you're going, as they say, you have to know where you come from. And so for us, a lot of us getting involved in Islamic, like young people coming in, getting involved in Islamic activities, whether you're from Trinidad, Guyana, the Caribbean, up here in the United States, it is important to know what are the things that influenced the Islamic work as we have it here today. For a lot of times we are involved, but we don't know where did these things come from? Where did these ideas come from? What was the root of some of this, the genesis of some of these things? And so I wanted to talk about two people who are perhaps the most influential personalities in the last century that have influenced and continue to influence so many of the Islamic efforts around the world. And it's important for you to know who they are and a little bit about them to appreciate your present reality and my present reality of what we are in. And the first one is brother by the name of Maulana Sayyid al-Banna Maududi. And the second one is Hassan al-Banna. I will give brief ideas of their life, but we're more interested in the ideas that they brought and how it came about to influence our work, which we'll comment at the end. Maulana Maududi, he was born in India, in Aurangabad, around the 1903. During this time, 1903, the first masjid that was built in the United States was like 1915. And in places like North Dakota and so on. But the one that continues to be available, those masjids were closed. And in 1935 is when you have perhaps what's called the mother of the mosques, continues to remain standing up to today, started by the Syrians. So I wanted to give you a picture of what America was like when these brothers were born. So on September the 25th, 1903, the Muslims' caliphate came to an end. So Maududi, he was born in 1903 and he died in 1979. And even though if you subtract those two, it seems 76. He was roughly around 75 years of age when he passed away. He was born in India. At that time, India, there was no Pakistan that existed. They were all India. And from very early, his father exposed him to a lot of Islamic knowledge. Teachers used to come to their house, literally. And so he's an Islamic scholar, he's a journalist, he's an activist, he's a historian, he's a jurist. And he was the youngest of three sons, and his father was a lawyer. He was married in 1937, which is kind of pretty late, at the age of 34, roughly, to Mahmouda Begum. And she came from a very rich family. And they had 6 sons and 3 daughters. Maududi was very sick for a large part of his life. His wife came from a very rich family, and so he was able to be financed and use money to be able to do his dawah work and to do his research, and all the activities came from him. But he suffered a lot from kidney ailment most of his life. He was bedridden in 1945, 1946, 1969. He had to go to England for treatment. And so his life was, a lot of times he was not well at all. In April 1979, the kidney again got worse, along with heart problems. And then he was transported to Buffalo, New York, where his son was a doctor there. And after having treatment there, he passed away in 1979 at the age of 75. His funeral was held in Buffalo, but he was buried back in Lahore in Pakistan, and there was a very large funeral procession. Yusuf al-Qardawi, you may have heard the name. He wrote Halal and Haram in Islam. One of the very, very famous alim who died not too long ago, about 2 years ago, led the funeral prayer. Maududi began his education, and up at the age of 9, before 9, he used to receive, as I mentioned, teachers used to be employed by his dad, and they would come to his home. So he didn't learn in the traditional way up to 9 years of age. He learned to speak Arabic, he learned Persian, he studied Islamic law, hadith. At 11, he went to formal Darul Uloom in Hyderabad and was very influenced by Sayyid Ahmed Khan in Delhi, who was actually one of the people that a lot of Maududi's ideas came from. He was a great reformist himself. In that setting, Maududi learned English, German, Western philosophy, sociology, history. So he was basically an academic. And in 1919, at the time when he was 16, he began to develop a Islamic modernist mindset, moved to Delhi, and began to study extensively about Islam. At 17 years of age, he became the editor of the Urdu newspaper, which was called Taj. And he worked also as editor of the Jamia newspaper, which was a group of Orthodox Muslims, for about 3 years, and had a lot of influence on people at that time. And in 1932, he joined another journal, Tarjuman al-Quran, from 32 to 37 for about 5 years. And he began to develop his political ideas during that time and turn towards his work of reviving Islam and beginning to advocate that Islam was an ideology, a complete way of life, what he called traditional and hereditary Islam religion. So during these times, of course, British was in control of India, and the people in India were advocating to get independence from British rule. Maududi became part of that struggle to secure independence from Britain. And in 41, he founded his own group. He became disenchanted with some of the Islamic groups that was there, and he decided to form his own group called Jamati Islami. And this was a religious group that also dealt in trying to get involved in the politics of the day and to promote Islamic values and practices. When the group was formed, it had an immediate attraction for the intellectual Muslims, the upper rich intellectuals of the Muslim society. They became attracted to Maududi's Jamati Islami, and they joined it. And so he began this struggle against the British. When the British eventually left, Maududi, the idea came now for to divide India into two parts. Maududi was opposed to this idea, the idea of forming Pakistan and to have the Muslims be in a separate country. He did not support this idea because he thought that this would divide the Ummah of India, that he will divide the Muslims into two camps. You will have people now in India and you will have Muslims in Pakistan. And so he felt that this was not a good idea. He felt that the Muslims should strive in India and work in India as one group to develop it. And so in 1947, the partition of India finally came, and the emerging of Pakistan as a country was formed. And so the Jamati Islami group now had to be divided as well, because now you had different countries. So Maududi became the head of the Jamati Islami in Pakistan. He migrated to Pakistan from the part of Hyderabad where he was in Aurangabad, and moved to Pakistan. When they had the division, but India dividing into two countries of Pakistan, there was a series of activities that happened, in that people who lived in India was given a choice that they could migrate to the newly formed Pakistan area. And the people, the Hindus who were in the Pakistan area, were given the chance to migrate to India, because they said Pakistan is going to be the Muslim country. And so if you want to leave, you can leave and go back to India. And if you want to, as a Muslim, come to Pakistan. And so many Muslims made that decision. They uprooted their whole life and moved to this new land with the promise of Pakistan. You know, and so there was a lot of moving around at that time at the formation of Pakistan in 1947. And so Maududi became the head of the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan. And then you had what is called Jamaat-e-Islami in Hind, in India. That became another branch of it. And then they had another branch in Bangladesh, Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh. Then they had other smaller groups in Kashmir. So the group became divided in different countries now. Maududi fought against the 1948, many of the Jamaat-e-Islami leaders were jailed because Maududi and his group objected that the government was sponsoring an insurgency, quietly making agreements on the surface, but at the back end was actually sponsoring an insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir. And so Maududi objected to this, saying there was a double standard here. You're preaching peace in the front, and then in the back, you're instigating taking over of these places. And so they were jailed as a result of this. In 1951 and 57, the group split. They had a big internal issue in the group. And the Jamaat-e-Islami, what happened was that Maududi was advocating now that Pakistan was formed and Pakistan was a reality, Maududi now turned his attention to trying to make Pakistan an Islamic country. And so he wanted to participate in the process of building Pakistan into an Islamic state. His vision was to make Pakistan, the word Pakistan means land of the pure, that he wanted to make this a pure Islamic state. And so he got involved in trying to compete in elections in Pakistan. But while he was trying to do that, they had an internal disagreement with themselves. And so there was a group of them that felt we should not compete in electoral politics. And another set of them said we should. And so Maududi was in favor of competing in the local politics as a way of getting power and leadership to be able to move Pakistan towards an Islamic state. He won over when they had the vote in the Jamaat-e-Islami's internal politics. Maududi's group, people sided with Maududi. And so a lot of the other leaders who disagreed with him, they left Jamaat-e-Islami. And so they had this split. And so Maududi, they continued to participate in elections. The Ahmadis, who was part of there, also began to get a lot of power. And Maududi began a campaign against the Ahmadi Jamaat community in Pakistan. And he wrote a small book called The Qadiani Problem. And then because of that book, in which he kind of like criticized the Qadiani and the Ahmadiyya, he was sentenced to death. So he was in jail for about 2 years, and then there was a public outrage that people said this is unacceptable. And so he was, they had to release him after 2 years. So they did not go through with the sentence. And then Maududi made a last-ditch effort to participate in the elections in 1970, and the Jamaat-e-Islami lost. They had about 151 candidates go up, and they lost very badly. After that, Maududi withdrew from political activism. His health was also declining. And so he resigned as the head of the Jamaat-e-Islami as their leader in 1972. In terms of his political ideas, um, as we mentioned, he was active in trying to get independence from the British. He was also against the creation of Pakistan initially, but once it got formed, he advocated that it should be ruled by Islam. He even submitted a draft constitution, was very active in putting together ideas of how the constitution of Pakistan should look like to be an Islamic state. Uh, he had a unique position from the Islamic society, from tradition, about the Islamic society that deviated with the traditional ulama. And of course, that put him in the radar for criticism and condemnation by the established ulama. Because Maududi believed that the Islam came to be superseded over all other systems, and that the sovereignty of Allah is better than man-made laws, and so it should be. He coined this term theodemocracy, and he said that the whole entire society should be based on Islamic values and Islamic idea and then Islamic ideology. Whereas the traditional ulama did not quite went so far. They were perfectly content to function within a society that was not completely Islamic. His view about non-Muslims, what happened is that they used to, at that time, tell him that, the non-Muslims are the majority group and Muslims were a small group. And, and Maududi began to explain Islam in a different way. And he said, look, all the universe is submitted to Allah. The birds submit to Allah because they are following how Allah created them. The tree is submitting to Allah. Every aspect of creation is actually doing what it was created for by Allah, and so it is in submission to Allah. The only two entities that are disobeying Allah is some of humanity and some of the jinns. So he advocated, he said the reality is, and because submission to Allah means Muslim, so he advocated the idea that everything in the universe was Muslim by its nature because it was submitted to Allah. And the only a few of humanity and jinn disobeyed Allah. So actually the majority of the universe were Muslims. And the non-Muslim was a small minority who disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he kind of flipped the concept of being Muslim in this way. He understood Islam as a vast way of life that incorporated every aspect of our life and not just a religion as we know it, where you practicing to get a spiritual high or a spiritual path to God, and it's a personal thing, that your religion is just your personal endeavor to God and has nothing to do with society or with life as a whole. He changed that concept to say that Islam is a complete way of life, and it has something to say about politics, economics, legislation, science, humanism, health, psychology, sociology, and that it is a system that does not discriminate and treats all human beings as equal before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so its message was to every human being. So this was part of the ideas that he brought. In terms of economics, the Muslims were grappling about this issue, and basically they were trying to say that we need to overhaul the Islamic understanding of economics. Maududi wrote a small book called The Economic Problem of Man and Its Islamic Solution, in which was considered one of the founding documents of modern Islamic economics. And so he advocated and says, we do not need a new economic science, that Islam has volumes of information that advocates for a complete economic system within Islam itself, a Sharia-based economic program that was viable, that was relevant, that could compete with whatever was in the world at the time. And so he did he kind of like put down the idea that we need a new economic system to be derived as taking some from the Western ideas and so on. Already believed in terms of modernism that Islam was as modern as tomorrow and that we do not need to become westernized. You see, he lived in a society where one of the problems that he saw among the people was because of the colonial influence of the West, of the British, who came and brought their system, brought their ideas, brought their clothes, brought their culture, brought their food, tried to instill all that, brought their language to the people, and the people became so entwined with the colonial style of life that they begin to think it was more because it came from people who ruled them. They began to look at that as being superior to what Islam have. And so they had now this problem of Muslims becoming very westernized, especially the elite, the ones who were going for the PhD and the masters and so on. The more they learned about and became intellectuals, the more westernized they became because they studied in a westernized format. And so the more apologetic they became, and they began to look at the Western ideas as better than Islam. And so Maududi said, no, Islam is as modern as ever. We do not need any ideas from the West to make Islam better. And so they used to study logic. And he said, and people would take the logical ideas and then try to see if Islam fits with it. And he came and he said, no, you have to take the Islamic ideas. And then if the logic does not fit in with what Islam says, then something is wrong with your logic, something is wrong with your science, that it is not quite there because Islam is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it is haq, it is correct. And so if you come with anything that contradicts this, the Quran and the Sunnah, then you have to re-examine your ideas and not just accept it as being the authority. Sufism, he was a bit critical of this because of a particular historical format, and that the Sufis, a lot of times they divorce themselves from proactively engage in solving the problems of the day. Sharia, Maududi believed that the Sharia was absolutely crucial to be able to have successful Islamic societies. And he said the society cannot really be fully Islamic unless we implement the Sharia. And so he didn't only talk these things, he actually wrote books. So when he talked about family life in Islam, he wrote literature on it. Talk about social economic affairs, he wrote literature, administration, duties of rights, human rights in Islam. He have written books, volumes of books about these issues, bringing these ideas of his to the fore so that the people in power can be able to look at them and the ulama can look at them. So he is regarded actually as one of the most influential of the contemporary Islamic revivalist scholars. His efforts of revivaling moved not from Pakistan, but moved throughout the Muslim world. In Iran, Maududi wrote over 73 books, 120 booklets and pamphlets. He made over 100 speeches, which were in turn translated and published in books. He did a tafsir of the Quran called Tafhim al-Quran, and he was a journalist. He translated this from Arabic to Urdu. And then from Urdu, we have translation to English. I have copies of the translation in English, and it's very different. It's very different, the translation, very unique in that when you read it, it sounds like very cohesive English language. And if you could get it, if you could go online at some time and just type Maududi's meaning of the Quran and look at some of the translations, you will see how beautiful it is. It's like you're reading a well-read essay, and these are ayahs from the Quran. And so at a very young age, at 24, he wrote his first book, which had 600 pages, called Jihad in Islam. A 24-year-old kid. He's written many, many books, so it became very popular with people in Europe and in the Middle East. And then eventually, when people moved to the United States and Guyana, so I grew up in Guyana with many of these books. I've read Tawars al Islam, I've read Paradise, Status of Women Islam, I've read Islamic Law and Constitution. I used to own all these books. Let Us Be Muslims, I've read that. Islamic Way of Life, I've read that. Amin of the Quran, I've read Short History of Religious Movement, I've read that. And used to have all of these in my library. Human Rights in Islam, I've read that and I still have a copy of that. Four Basic Quranic Terms, Islamic Revolution, The Unified Muslim World, Foundation, all of these books I've read. I grew up on a lot of these because these were the books that was being translated into English and sent to the Caribbean, both Trinidad and Guyana, and also over here in the United States. The Qadian, from all of these books I've read and used to own every one of them. Till I give away my books. And so he wrote many, many books and had a tremendous influence on the youth all over the world, Malaysia, in Indonesia, and so on. He wrote other books, Islamic Law and the Introduction in Pakistan. He wrote so many important pieces of literature that are still around today. And so his influence continues all over. I used to study Urdu with one of the Imams in Guyana, and he had a large library. And when I went, I saw he was a bookseller. And I looked at his library. He had so many Maududi books. So I said, "Do you know this man?" And it turned out that he used to write to Maududi in Pakistan. All his questions that he had, he would actually send a letter to Maududi and ask these questions. He said Maududi would reply. And he showed me letters that he had from Maulana Maududi to him, this one lone Imam in my country. And so his influence continues up to today. And we'll talk more about that soon. The next person that we want to talk about is Hassan al-Banna. He was born around the same time, 1906. And he died in 1949. He didn't live very long. He was actually assassinated. So he lived just about, 43 years. He was born in Egypt, in Cairo. His father was an imam and used to teach at the mosque and educated at Al-Azhar. Hassan al-Banna, from very, very young, memorized Quran. He was 12 years old. He used to actually, from the very early age, showed a tremendous activist mentality. He used to walk around his village and he would go and wake up people for Fajr in the morning. He would walk every house and wake them up. He participated in demonstration. He again became disenchanted with the British rule in Egypt. And so he had his education. He entered 1923, he went to Darul, which was a teacher training school in Cairo, and studied Islam, graduated in 27, and was given a position of an Arabic language teacher. And he got the opportunity to learn and to meet many prominent scholars. One of the unique things about Hassan al-Banna was that after he began to study in Cairo, he spent about 4 years there, and he saw how bad and how westernized Egypt was, how the youth was losing their Islam, how people had diluted Islamic practices to so bad that Hassan al-Banna became disenchanted. He became very, very sad at this reality. And so what he did was, instead of sitting and lamenting that, he began an active program of teaching people and sharing and spreading dawah. According to Jamal Badawi, he visited almost 3,000 villages. He would give dawah everywhere, in nightclubs, wherever it is, in the coffee shops, on the train, wherever he was. And he was blessed to be very healthy his whole life. And so he started to conduct classes and give dawah in pubs, everywhere, wherever he found himself. Began to call people back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He would teach classes to kids in the day, and in the night he would teach their parents. He had so much energy, and he began to, of course, when you begin to spread messages in this way and become very active, you will inevitably end up developing enemies, and you will have people who will push back. And so the elite, the religious elite, slowly began to have issues with him. And Hassan al-Banna wanted to avoid having confrontations with Muslims. And so he avoided that. When he looked at Al-Azhar, he saw, that Al-Azhar was not performing the role that it was supposed to perform and not producing a kind and quality of Islamic scholars that was needed. There was a rise of atheism, and Islamic missionaries were flooding, Christian missionaries were flooding Egypt. And so he became very concerned about this. And so he decided, that he going to take on this challenge himself. So while studying in Cairo, we saw this decline. And so he began to really study even more about his faith so he could spread the message. He was exposed to Rashid Rida, who was a very famous scholar. He started a magazine. He used to read from the Al Rida magazine, Al Manar. And eventually he formed in 1928 the Islamic Brotherhood, what is called Ikhwan al-Muslimun. You'll probably have heard this as being a terrorist group by some of the media. They always refer to Ikhwan al-Muslimun as being a terrorist entity. Hassan al-Banna created in 1928 the Islamic Brotherhood, and it was an organization in which was very, very, very vibrant, and it began to challenge the Western ideology, began to call people back to pure Islam. All the decay that he saw in the youth, he began to grapple and to challenge the youth to rethink about their faith. And so people began to galvanize towards this group. It became a mass group. And so Hassan al-Banna's leadership began to grow in stature. He had branches in Syria, in Sudan, in Jordan, all over. His influence began in Iran, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. And so it began to expand very much. The Ikhwan also brought to the people. They had so much different branches of different setup of charities, of orphanages, of different institutions that provided social services for the people. And so, and one of the things that was very, very good with the Ikhwan was that their structure. They had a very, very well-designed organizational structure, that allowed them to be able to do a lot of work. So it grew from a small association to a major political power in a very short time. They had branches in every province in Egypt. They had an administrative board. They had executive councils. They had a central branch in these provinces. They had specialized committees and departments. For example, education, Department of Labor, Department of Scouting, Department of Propaganda, Department of Families, Department of Social Services, Department of Communication with the Muslim world, Department of Sisters. And the Sisters of the Ikhwan was an absolutely amazing people. And so they had three main bodies that coordinated: founding assembly, executive office, membership committee. So the structure was really, really amazing. And then they had a graduated approach: communicate and propagate, then mobilize and organize, and then execute and implement the Islamic principles. Hassan al-Banna himself wrote many principles in terms of how Muslims should approach the dawah and how they should organize themselves. And they rejected violence as a way of spreading the message. Then, of course, because they were spreading so much in India, in Egypt, people actually considered them like a second government within Egypt. So powerful they were. They fought in the Palestinian conflict when the Muslims fought Palestine in that war in 1936 to 39, called the Arab Revolt in Palestine. The Ikhwan was very, very big and involved in that as well. So when Nasir, Gamal Abdel Nasir, not not Gamal, Nasir, forget his last name. He became to power, and so he clamped down on all of these uh, political powers, all of these different Islamic groups. But he left the Ikhwan. He didn't do anything to them. And then when he became very strong, he eventually turned and persecuted the members of the Ikhwan. About 60,000 of them was arrested in one night. They began to arrest them, declare the organization illegal, seized all their assets, and all their members were imprisoned. So they were left almost overnight fleeing to all parts of the Middle East. You had Muhammad Qutb, he went to Saudi Arabia. So many people, you had Said Ramadan, who went to Sweden. And so his son is called Tariq Ramadan, who's today one of the most influential scholars in the world. And so they fled and they went to different parts of the Muslim world. And what happened because of that, each places they went, they started Islamic work again. And so the Ikhwan's influence grew as a result of this persecution, because now they were in every place, in Jordan, in Libya, in every country in the Islamic world. You had the brothers from the Brotherhood was there, influencing people and starting work. So Hassan al-Banna himself, as he grew, it became necessary that they have to deal with him as a threat. And so he was assassinated and killed. And despite all efforts to stifle the Muslim Brotherhood, they continued to grow and they continued to get stronger even after the passing of Hassan al-Banna. And almost every Islamic group in the Middle East grew as a result of being influenced by him and his group. And so the secret police in Egypt in 1949 is when they assassinated him. And so he wrote about 2,000 articles, many books. There's an autobiographical novel that he also wrote. And the legacy of Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood is that they had, Hassan al-Banna from very early had a very strong spiritual connection. And so the members of the Ikhwan, when you meet them, you will see that they have a deep connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot of them, they're very close to Allah and they're very humble, and they are activist mentality, and they're very well organized. They come from the position that Islam does not need the West to help it, that, Islam is its own and can survive on its own. They have influenced very many groups in the Middle East. And when the members of the Ikhwan, eventually a lot of them also came to the United States, just like the members of Jamaati Islami also came to the United States. And when they came here to the United States, now the situation in Egypt was that the Ikhwan, because of the persecution that was being placed on them, a lot of them began to operate underground, like secretive. They didn't want to tell you much about themselves and so on. And so they came to the United States as students in the university. And one of the things that they did in the university, the brothers of the Muslim Brotherhood, they formed societies in the universities called MSAs, Muslim Students Association. And so these students, they galvanized in the university from the background they had, and then their children and so on. There are now 3 generations that we have, I think, started the MSAs. And so you will probably have heard of MSA. This was started by these brothers. And of course, they get handed down to next and third generation. But the MSA eventually give birth to ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, which is one of the largest Islamic groups in America. And they would express this, that the child gave birth to its mother, because ISNA now became the head and MSA became under ISNA. And ISNA is a very large organization of Muslims from every different color, race, culture, a language. Their convention that they hold every year, I think the one they had recently, about 30,000 people usually attend. And they have many, many departments and branches and so on. Part of what happened at ISNA is that initially, the original founders began to function with this secretive idea because they didn't understand the methodology or the society in America, which was a society that it was open, you were free to practice your faith, and so you didn't have to be secretive. You should operate above board, because when you operate secretive, people tend to feel you're clandestine and that what are you hiding and so on. So it took one generation for the new generation to realize that we are now in America. And so they have moved away from some of the uh, way in which the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt who came used to function. This new generation now is open, their dawah is open, their work is open, and they function, within the parameters of the rule of law. Um, Orientation wise, a lot of them inherited from their parents this strong tree thing which we mentioned, activist mentality, connecting to Allah, and organizational orientation. This was very, very much in the Muslim Brotherhood. And when you meet any one of those brothers and when you hear them speak, you will always see there's an activist way in which they talk, and there's a spiritual way in which they talk, and their personal life, when you examine it, very organized. One of the people who was influenced, our original people, was Jamal Badawi, Ahmad Sakr. And if you look at these brothers, energy and dawah, and tremendous amount of uh, things that they have produced. The brothers who came from the Jamati Islami, they ended up also being part of ISNA, but their orientation of ISNA was not suited to what they were accustomed to. And so eventually, shortly after, the brothers from the Jamati Islami decide to form their own group called Islamic Circle of North America, ICNA. And so they moved away, and most of them was from the Pakistani subcontinent, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And so they formed ICNA because they also felt that ISNA was not as serious, if you want to put want a better word, was not as stringent that they thought it should be. So ICNA became its own group, and they have now evolved and become also one of the biggest Islamic groups with many, many branches and different. You have ICNA Relief, you have Helping Hand, you have so many different branches and so many areas that they're involved in the dawah over here. Their orientation was, of course, from Maulana Maududi, and his orientation of being relevant, Islam being relevant, Islam being practical. And so these two groups continue to influence the efforts in the Middle East and also in America here as well. These two brothers, whose work continue to withstand the test of time, even though we're living in a new century now. Now there's a new, they have become less relevant. Slowly, their ideas are being changed because we now are moving to a new reality. Their reality was more or less the West being a very big challenge. Now the Muslims have developed new ideas, and so you will find young Muslims who will perhaps be critical of their work on today's time, and also with the label of the Ikhwan, because there are many versions of the Muslim Brotherhood. As they go into different countries, they develop different types of activism, and so they get labeled sometimes, as I said, as a very bad group. The works of these two, and when you read their books, you could really, as I said, I myself grew up reading these literature of both Hassan al-Banna Maulana, that he wrote a book called What is the Message? And he did not write many books, but he gave speeches. and he also had instructions more or less for people to follow. Um, and so we had in the Caribbean, in Guyana, and in Trinidad. In Trinidad, we had a brother there who came, whose father was a member of Jamaati Islami, and when his son graduated, he told his son, go and do dawah some part in the world, and he traveled to Trinidad. He picked Trinidad from India. His name was Said Hussein Pasha. He's still alive. He's probably very old now. He lives in Seattle. I'm not Seattle, upstate New York. But he went to Trinidad and he transformed Trinidad, right? A lot of the influence of the Islamic Trust and those brothers that you see doing real work in Trinidad was influenced by him. Single-handedly, he changed Trinidad, all right? And then he left. And in Guyana came Ahmed Ehwas from Libya, who was in charge of affairs in Libya, and who also had some influence from Hassan al-Banna and some of those teachings. And so he changed not only Guyana, but he changed and influenced the whole Caribbean. Barbados, St. Vincent, Jamaica, Suriname, all of those countries was influenced by him single-handedly. He only spent about 4 years in the Caribbean. And so the work of these two brothers actually continued, and their influence in terms of understanding Islam as a dynamic system that is comprehensive, that can stand alone, that does not need the West, that you don't need to apologize to the Western values, but you can live in a pluralistic society, still practice Islam, and still be able to function. And so if you go to Trinidad and you go to Guyana, you will see how big and large the work that they do have become because of the influence of these two brothers who were also influenced by these two men. And so I wanted to give you this little framework so that when you look at the Islamic work and you understand, you get an understanding of how these things came about and how they were initiated. I know the history is very long and very detailed. I hope I've captured at least a summary idea in terms of to give you the understanding of knowing where some of these things that you probably heard about have come from. Assalamu alaikum.